Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to a brand new episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast for DailyDud.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and I am joined this week by Derek Anderson and Emily Von Seele. Am I correct? I love saying your name's just so fancy, like Emily.
You're 100% correct.
Yay!
Perfect.
I always feel like it's a badge of honor. But we are gathered here today to talk about werewolves for our Class of 81 series, because as it turns out, everybody had werewolf fever in 1981. It was a great time to be a horror fan and an even better time to be a werewolf fan. So
go ahead. It's amazing. It's like everyone had the same idea and they just had to rush it in theaters at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm a little bit older than both of you guys. So I've seen one of these in theaters. So one of my very first movie going memories was actually seeing American Werewolf in London in a movie theater, which is
cool.
Not a movie you take a 3-year-old to necessarily.
Yeah, I could see that parts of that would be maybe a little like over the head of a 3-year-old, but
yeah, but it's funny because do
you remember how you reacted?
I remember, I think I was fine. Like I was always okay, like as a little kid in theaters. I do remember, pardon me. I remember sitting there, and I remember the scene in the movie theater when they're sitting there talking, and when Jack shows up and he's talking to David, and they're sitting in the theater, and I just remember thinking to myself, like, it felt weird because we're in a movie theater and it was a movie theater on the screen, and that was weird to me. Like, I don't know if my brain was clicking on that, like maybe that was really happening in my theater. But the famous story is that my mom, it was me and my mom, and then my mom's best friend, who's my auntie, and she's not somebody who loves horror movies whatsoever. That might have been her only real horror movie she'd ever seen. And I think at a certain point, she said to my mom, "Oh, Heather looks really scared. I'm going to go ahead and take her out." But I think it was her who was really scared. Because then I just remember playing Pac-Man afterwards because my aunt loved Pac-Man. So that was kind of like my memories of that experience. So, but yeah, it's pretty amazing that we got, in the year of 1981, we had 4 different werewolf movies come out, all different approaches to the werewolves, all in the space of 12 months. Like that does not happen anymore. We're starting to get a little more werewolves now. In the last year, we've had the Wolf of Snow Hollow. We've had Werewolves Within, Bloodthirsty, all 3 different, very different approaches and stuff. So it feels like 40 years later, we're having this werewolf renaissance, and I am totally cool with that.
Yes, I agree. We seem to go very long times without werewolves. So whenever we get like that bump and everyone kind of remembers that they exist and they are really good for storytelling, it's a special moment.
Yeah, it was kind of like zombies was 10 to 15 years ago. And then now werewolves might be the next one. I know we had vampires in there somewhere, but it does seem to go in waves. And I actually watched recently Silver Bullet was on TV, and I was watching that, and I'm like, I know this wasn't 81, but it was around that time period. And I maybe should have been watching, more maybe like Full Moon High or something, but I was like, Silver Bullet's just so damn good.
Oh yeah, you can't go wrong with Silver Bullets. That's one of my favorites. But yeah, unfortunately we're not doing, I think that's 87, 85. Yes. So yeah, I think we did 85 before, and I think Patrick took Silver Bullet. I think I was too intimidated to talk about one of my favorites, but I love Silver Bullet. I love werewolf movies, honestly. Like my kitchen, we have 3 posters up, and 2 of them are werewolf movies. So, I'm nice. Very much a big fan, and I think it comes down to, and of course, a lot of it culminates like in this year of 1981 with the werewolves from Rick Baker and from, oh my goodness, I can't believe.
Rob
Bottin.
Jeez Louise. And I write books about this stuff. I'm like, who? What's that guy's name?
The other guy.
Well, it sort of stuck in my head because Rick Baker was originally supposed to do the werewolves for the Howling. But because of the timing, he had to leave the Howling to go over to American Werewolf because he'd already made the commitment to Landis. So that's when, and he recommended Rob Bottin to Joe Dante to come in.
Cool.
But it's interesting to me that like basically the bar was kind of set for werewolves in 81. And I don't think it's ever been raised since.
Like, no, I think that between those two movies, they set the werewolf movie template. Between American Werewolf and The Howling, you get two very different approaches, two really different plots, and like the two titans of practical effects transformation sequences.
Yeah, and they're very different.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and it's like Rob Bottin doing The Thing, like, and then The Howling. That's just such an amazing run for him, and then of course all the other stuff he would end up doing. But it kind of is like, I'm kind of glad that the timing didn't work out for Baker, because then we got two, like you said, two very different approaches. And what are the odds that 40 years later these are still like the standard for werewolf makeup effects? You'd think like, oh, somewhere along the way someone would kind of like take that gauntlet and become like the new leader in that department. But it's like these two guys are still, I think, regarded as the best makeup effects artists for that type of werewolf.
Yeah. And I mean, we've had good werewolves like since then, like, you know, you have the underworld werewolves, but they're a little different. And you know, those come from like Patrick Tatopoulos. So they're a little more European flavored, because he likes to do very astute chins on all of his creatures. So even his werewolves have these like chins to them. If you go back and look, that's like his thing. You know, we have the albino werewolf from like Ginger Snaps, which was a headache, I know, for Paul Jones, and he still gets grief over it. But I still really like what he was able to do with that, despite of the director, which is like a whole shebang. We could save that for a Ginger Snaps episode, though. I'm trying to think of like other really prominent, like, you know, we have, you mentioned Silver Bullet, which unfortunately that werewolf ends up looking a little bit like a teddy bear. So, you know, I love and respect Carlo Rambaldi, but he wasn't probably one of the top guys out there, because he was a little more abstract, I think, of an artist. So I don't think he was necessarily the right guy to do that. Or if you watch something like The Howling 2, this Fox Studios sent over monkey costumes from Planet of the Apes for them to use for werewolf suits.
What?
Yeah. So
close enough.
Yeah, that's exactly, I think, what they thought. And I remember when I talked to Philippe Moore about it, he joked that's how they worked in the line about the monkey phase into that movie, because they had to, because all of their werewolves like apes. So It's not easy to pull off a really great werewolf. It really isn't. It's, you know, and it's like from a time and cost perspective, like it sucks up a lot of time. It's a huge use of resources. So I think that's why people got a little gun shy with them for a while, or they tried to do more digital stuff. Like I remember, I think it was The Howling Reborn that came out like 2012 or something like that. I think the werewolf was digital. Like full on digital. That was a bummer. I was like, you're The Howling. You shouldn't be a digital werewolf.
There's something really specific about, I don't know, the werewolf. I think between the texture of the fur plus the body type plus the way it moves, like if you're going to do it digitally and it's going to look bad, it's going to look so bad. Like a bad digital werewolf is like the bargain basement bottom of the crappy digital effect pile.
Yeah, and it's just, you run a risk of just not aging as well. I mean, the practical effects are so much more palpable, and then digital effects are so constantly changing. It just feels like there's more of a constant there with practical effects, and especially with the werewolf, where you want to see like the little details, all the little hairs, and like that's what's so great about particularly like the American Werewolf in London transformation is it's done in such a well lit room, and you can see all those little details, and that's what makes it so freaky too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we'll talk more about like the movies, but since we're doing all the effect stuff up front, it's interesting to me because this was the year when basically it was Rick Baker and Stan Winston who petitioned to have a category added. Their intention was for special makeup effects. Hair ended up sort of making its way into the category, so it's hair and makeup. To me, like I always feel like they should be separate because hair is a really interesting art form all in its own. That sure they kind of work in tandem with makeup, but it's totally different things. And artists should be recognized for that separately. But it's interesting because the category did not exist until 1981. And then, you know, basically it's like, so it was kind of like Rick Baker, like created his own Academy Award category to go off and win the next year. Which, you know, and Stan Winston was up for it as well because he had done Heartbeeps, which I wrote about this week. And so it's interesting to me that like 81 feels to me like the dawn of this new era of special effects. That one's for you, Patrick. Era. And, you know, so it's kind of cool that like, you know, special effects have been, you know, part of movies ever since like the very beginning, since Nosferatu. But it was, you know, it took all those years for them to finally start to get the recognition. And, you know, even, I would say even more so than Rick Baker, it had been really Stan Winston who had pushed for years and years and years to make directors and make producers and make studios take the time to recognize the work of special effects artists properly. Like he was the one who started to push for special effects artists to get credited on like the title blocks, which is like the stuff that goes on like the movie poster and stuff like that. Because prior to the 80s, that really never happened. So it's interesting. It feels like for me, 81 is like really the genesis of like modern makeup effects. And I feel like this was like the jumping off point where anything was possible after this.
Yeah, and the fact that both of these films came out like, you know, at that dawn of this new era, it feels like the industry as a whole just kind of came out swinging and said, hey, look, this is the awesome stuff that we can put together.
Yeah, and it's just amazing too. Like there's so many decades of great makeup effects and it took that long. But then, yeah. I'm so glad that it actually happened in the dawn of the 80s, because as we know, that's just such a heyday for horror movies, especially. And then, you know, horror maybe didn't get as much credit or respect, especially back then. So it's kind of nice that a little niche was carved out for artists, particularly in that genre, to get some recognition finally. So
definitely.
Thank you, Rick Baker.
So do you guys prefer the standing up werewolf or do you prefer the more dog-like werewolf?
Ooh.
It's hard. I think generally I prefer the more stand-up werewolf. I already forgot if we mentioned it or not, but the the werewolf body type that I really, really find myself loving is now I lost it. Dog soldiers. That is a look that I really, really like.
I could see that.
Yeah, that's another great example. And yeah, there's something, I think to me, the creepier version is the like humanoid standing up, walking around on two legs, just because it kind of reminds you that this is still a person who's undergone this transformation, as opposed to you can kind of get lost with, you almost start to think like it's really a wolf if it is like on all fours running around, even though I think in American Werewolf in London, there's a lot of things that they do that still remind you that it's a human. But yeah, I think I do prefer just the kind of the creepiness of the two-legged werewolf the most.
Yeah, it feels a little more other to me. Like it's not a human, it's not a wolf, it's this other creature.
Yeah, I think for me, because it harkens back to the original Wolfman too, that I tend to like that type of werewolf. But it's funny too, because when you look at the 4 different werewolf movies of 81, you've got the 2 sort of more traditional ones, which are The Howling and Full Moon High. And then American Werewolf and Wolfen are both more dog-like creatures. So even then it was like sort of this like little like line. Although I will say, and we'll talk a little about Wolfen, but like I like how, you know, we have with Howling and with American Werewolf, it's very much a show and tell scenario. Whereas with Wolfen, they're play really coy with it for a long time. And we don't really get any sort of reveals. And ultimately they're just kind of like wolves. They're not like, you know, the wolf from American Werewolf. They're like, they look like just normal wolves that are roaming about.
Yeah, but a little bit angrier somehow.
Yes. But I think that serves that story pretty well, because it's, you know, it's hard to say that a werewolf movie is set more in reality. It has more of a realistic tone to it. But out of all of them, I think Wolfen is the most realistic. if that's a thing for werewolf movies.
And the way they kind of like there's like they weave in like all these real world elements, and it's like the less is more approach. So you start thinking it's something way more like monstrous than it actually is. But yeah, I would say a little different than the Howling werewolf running around or dancing around the like the bonfire and that kind of stuff.
Yes, although the Howling does have the advantage with its animated transformation sequence during the sex scene, which I think it's the best thing ever. I just, for some reason, I just always thought that was so charming, and I know it looks terrible now. I don't care. I love it. I would rather
it's part
see
of
that.
it.
Yeah,
right.
So it's just so ingenious and so wonderfully, like with such wonderful rough edges to it. I'm just like, yeah, how can I be mad at this movie? This is fantastic. Like, I don't know, like when you guys kind of came into these movies, like if you saw them as kids or not, but like for me, like The Howling, like American Werewolf was a movie that like everybody kind of seemed to watch because of John Landis, because of his previous experiences in comedies and things like that. So it seemed like the more accessible, where The Howling kind of felt like it's dirty, like it felt like a dirty secret in a way, because it's like it just felt dangerous to me as a kid, because it's like you're, you know, part of it's like in a porn shop, and everybody's really animalistic, and you know, God bless what's her name, Elizabeth Brooks, who plays Marcia in that movie, because like she just oozes sex like from minute one, and you're like, oh, this woman is up to no good, and she is not. But it always felt like this really dangerous movie with an edge. And I guess it took me a really long time to understand that it was a dark comedy, because as a kid, it scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I was way more familiar with American Werewolf in London because my dad had actually seen that movie in theaters when he was in high school. And so he would quote, like, I would hear like quotes from that movie, and it was kind of on TV, I think, more than any of the others. So I would see like little bits and pieces, but like Griffin Dunn had so many great lines in that movie. And sometimes like, sometimes I'd hear little phrases from it or like the slaughtered lamb, and I'd hear references to that, or like, oh, the nurse, huh? And stuff like that. Like it just like all these like comedic elements that came out of that movie, I would kind of like, it just seemed a little more accessible. And so I was familiar with that. And then finally saw it like when I was in high school. And then of course with like John Landis as the director, having seen like Blues Brothers and that kind of stuff, it was a little more like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this director's work. And so I'll go in that way. And then The Howling was definitely like, I think I watched it it was probably like high school, college for the first time. So it was on DirecTV. It was like a free movie for a month kind of thing. And it's really funny because I love Small Soldiers, and I saw that in theaters when I was growing up. And then I find out later that the guy who directed that also directed The Howling, and it was just like my mind just exploded.
I think I saw both either in college or shortly thereafter. And I don't really remember the circumstances, but I knew that I had an understanding that, okay, there are two groundbreaking werewolf movies at the altars of which every horror nerd worships, and I have seen neither of them. So I need to correct that. So I think I saw both of them, probably not like back to back double featured, but I think I saw them both in fairly short order. And American Werewolf just stuck with me. I liked The Howling. It was fun, but it's something that has kind of grown on me in the years since. And American Werewolf was just an instant classic.
Yeah, it's tough for me because, like, you know, Landis doesn't exactly have the best legacy anymore. You know, I think he's sort of dried up a lot of goodwill with a lot of fans out there. So it's tough because, like, this was a huge movie for me as a kid. But I think, like, as I've gotten older, I think I revisit The Howling more. Also because Brian is like, he's a little weird about British stuff. I don't know how to explain it. But he's like every time we watch a movie and somebody's doing an American accent, and then I'll do a junket for it and I'm talking to him, he's like, they're British? He's like, of course they're British. He was like, it's just like this weird, it's like everybody's British. So he's like, oh, the British are taking over. So getting him to sit down and watch American Werewolf is a little bit tougher. But The Howling we watch a lot. Because for me, it's like The Howling is such like a visceral experience. Where American Werewolf feels a little more experimental in a way, like, which I like. I like the fact that it just sort of, there's times where the movie doesn't really feel like it has a roadmap. And it feels like you're like existing in these moments, which I like that. And I appreciate that. But it's interesting because, like, I think there's always like this camps where, like, people will draw that definitive line where it's like The Howling versus American Werewolf, like Beatles versus Elvis and things like that. Like, people have like the one that they prefer. And I think as a kid, I would immediately always tell people, oh, American Werewolf in London. But as an adult, like, I'm like, oh, but The Howling is like so good. So it's tough. It's interesting. I think it's also fun to sort of, when you grow up watching things and then you sort of watch it like from like under an adult lens, like it changes a lot. Because you sort of rediscover things about the movies that you never saw. But I'm such a weirdo. Like, as a kid, like, I'm from Chicago, so it's like it's technically against the law not to like the Blues Brothers, but I've never liked the Blues Brothers. And I know it's horrible, and I really should rewatch it as an adult, but I just haven't been able to bring myself to do it.
It's I know it's as a Chicagoan, that's like a rite of passage, right? You have to be like a Blues Brothers diehard fan. Yeah.
And I've never been able to really get into it, which is weird because my mom used to watch it all the time, but I just never really got into it. I also hate Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So that's my other.
I feel like most of us have reached a point now in, like, I think between where our lives have taken us and where the world is, where we all just recognize that Ferris Bueller is a huge jerk.
Oh, he's a total dick.
He's a total dick. It took us a while to come to that conclusion, but I think we're all there now.
As a kid, I totally related way more with his sister Jeannie than I ever did with him. And I hated him so much in that movie. Like, I was just like, oh, he just gets away with everything. And like, he's a criminal, like, kid. Like, and he ruins his best friend's life. And he's like, all right, I'm going to go home with my hot girlfriend. And that's that. And I'll just leave you to clean up this mess. Like,
see you tomorrow.
Yeah. I always hated Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I remember seeing it drive-in and I was so mad. I could never get into it. So, but yeah, so those are my, you know, when you're from Chicago, you're supposed to like certain movies. And I just, for some reason, I'll give the Blues Brothers another chance because I know it's a classic and there's certain parts that I still remember. And I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of fun. But like,
Carrie Fisher. And
I know.
Great cast.
And they do the great chase scene in that mall.
Oh, yeah.
I'm totally blanking on the mall. Something Square Mall. I'm totally blanking on it. But yeah, I know I should give it another go. But it's just tough these days because, like, every time I just think of John Landis, I just kind of like, oh, all right. I wish I kind of could have lived in that naivete just for a little bit longer. But, you know, unfortunately, I didn't.
I feel ya.
Yeah, I know. I was just kind of one of those, like, I didn't really even know about a lot of the stuff until like the last 10 years. So I remember meeting Landis at I think it was Horror Hound 2006. I want to say back in Indianapolis. And I remember meeting him there. And I remember telling him how I took my mom took me at like age 3 and he called her like a sick blankety blank. And I was just like, okay, that was a little extreme, but all right.
Whoa.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I was
Yeah.
about that with my
Necessary,
mom.
but okay.
Yeah. I was like, it was a little extreme reaction.
Jeez.
But he signed my Masters of Horror copy of Family. So
Cool.
Which is a great episode. So I can't go wrong there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's strange, but it's so interesting to me that like, that they're both comedies, and yet there's, for me, American Werewolf always feels more like a tragedy in the end.
Yes.
I always cry at the end.
Yeah. I feel like it ends very obviously suddenly, but you get that bittersweet ending. And it's really impactful. And like, for me with American Werewolf, like I get how it falls under the label of horror comedy. But for me, it feels more like a horror movie with funny moments because, the horror and the comedy, they tend to stay a little bit more separate with this script. So it's a movie that I still find really intense at times, and the funny moments don't, cut down on that, which makes it an interesting viewing experience, I think.
Yeah, it's like I always think of it as one of the best examples of like a horror comedy because it has both without them really affecting or overshadowing each other's elements. I mean, there's like the great scene where David Naughton's character calls home and his parents aren't home, and it's like his little sister, and it's such a great like little tender moment, and he's basically realizes that it's probably the last time he's gonna have a chance to even talk with his family, and he's in this place so far away from home, and it just bounces back between them so good. And like with Griffin Dunn's character Jack, like he's really funny, but at the same time like there's this tragic undertone of like, yeah, every time you see me, I'm a little more decomposed, and I'm still joking around with you, but it also like he's telling him to kill himself, and there's this like great kind of representation of survivor's guilt and PTSD. So it's like it just, but then like they're kind of joking about all the different, like all of his victims are kind of like joking with him in the movie theater. So it's like it's such a great balance of those two elements. And I think I really appreciated that rewatching it. And I'm like, man, this really holds up well with like both the horror and the comedy.
Yeah, I would say the Howling is a little more of the feel good ending. I mean, not feel good necessarily because poor Dee Wallace.
She is not feeling good.
No, she does not have a fun ending, but we get sort of that little like pitch black comedy twist from Joe Dante, where Marcia's sitting at the bar wanting her burger very rare, if you will. And to me, just for some reason, I could just that image of the burger cooking on the grill as the music starts to wash over it. Like I just like for some reason, it always leaves me chuckling a little bit.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that Emily pointed out. So this is something we said like the first time we watched Howling after we got Winnie, that like when Karen White transforms into the most adorable werewolf ever.
She is the cutest werewolf.
She is. She looks like an Ewok, but she looks she looks like Winnie, our dog. And the first time we saw her, we were like, "Oh my god, she looks so like Winnie." So we always joke with her that we should have just named our dog Dee Wallace, because the vets had been like, "What?" Like, okay, sure. As if, bringing our dogs, Johnny Utah and Winifred Sanderson into the vet isn't weird enough already, but,
So perfect.
But yeah, that is a really sad moment. But I love Dee Wallace's character in this. And for me, I think what she's the reason I love The Howling so much, because I think there's so much emotion that she brings to the table in this, like in an otherwise darkly comedic script. Like you have, her relationship with her husband, that's kind of on the rocks, which is Christopher Stone, who was Dee's real life husband at the time. and just the disconnect that happens between them, and how they're just, they're two people like that are supposed to be like in this relationship that they just can't make it work. And for one reason or another, like it's just their timing is off, everything is off, they're closed off from each other, and ultimately be going up to what's supposed to be like this healing retreat ends up being, the reason behind the collapse of their marriage, essentially. But there's so much that she brings to the table in that movie, that everybody loves Dee Wallace as the mom in E.T., and she's so great in Cujo, and she kicks so much ass. But like for me, her role as Karen White, like I loved her growing up as a kid, because I think part of me was like, I thought I was going to be that kind of journalist, not one that was hunting werewolves in porn shops, but I thought I was going to end up doing like more news type stuff. So I always really looked up to Karen White. Like to me, like she was somebody who was like, she was scared, but she was still fearless. And to me, like that was like, it was okay to be strong, but show emotion. And that's why I always love that about her performance in The Howling.
Yeah, I fully agree. She does such an amazing job. And that character is, she's carrying so much throughout that film. And Wallace is able to show it all and not let one aspect outweigh another aspect, and just give us the full range of what this character is going through.
Yeah, she's amazing. And it is kind of, everyone kind of thinks of E.T. with her, which is kind of a shame, because even though it's a great movie, great performance in that, like this is, I think, where she really got to like just take ownership of the entire movie and just go through so much and have such like a character arc. And it was just, I don't know, it still holds up so well. And I think it's largely due to her performance, and in addition to the practical effects and everything. But yeah, Dee Wallace is definitely, I just think that it really holds up well. And I don't know, the whole setting of the colony too is as like this place where they're supposed to get better, and it ends up just being like this just horrifying place. I think that's very, such a great backdrop for like a werewolf story. And then it kind of like, you think it's one thing and then it just turns into something else entirely.
Yeah, both of them are sort of fish out of water stories, really, when you look at it. Like Karen going up into this commune, and then you have David Kessler in American Werewolf, who's traveling abroad. It's just so interesting to me that like both movies really kind of play with the idea of the other in a very interesting way, except that the others really do become others in a supernatural way too. So, although that's probably a little deeper than I meant that to go.
It's true though. It
is. It is.
We're taking these characters who are in an unfamiliar scenario, and then we're just making it more unfamiliar as the story goes on.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead.
Oh no. And it's interesting too, that like both Dee Wallace and David Naughton's characters, they're like both trying to get over like a trauma, and then so it's kind of like a representation of, they're kind of like, they're never going to be the same person again after what they went through. So it's almost like, I guess if you really want to go deep, you could say it's, you write a thesis on that, but it's kind of interesting how the whole werewolf transformation kind of represents, or could represent, that as well.
Yes. If I was Dr. Wagner here, I would say there's definitely some underlying trauma that's manifesting itself through these supernatural beings. But yeah, it's interesting to me, because also like I wanted to point, because like, Joe Dante's a director, always works with a lot of the same actors throughout his movies, which for some reason, when certain directors do it these days, it's a problem. But back then, nobody seemed to care, which and I'm always a big fan of whenever directors kind of rely on the same people, because it's just fun. It's like, oh, there's that person and this person. But Robert Picardo in this movie is absolutely freaking terrifying. And like, he is so scary. Like Eddie Quist to me was like the most terrifying thing ever. And the way like he was so confrontational, like, because usually when you're this other kind of creature, like you're usually not as like in your face about it. And like, he doesn't care. Like he's just right there. And for me, like the scene, like when he takes the pardon me, when he takes the file out of Terry's hand, when he's like fully transformed, which is again is a funny moment, but also one of the scariest moments because you're like, oh God. I was like, he's here. Okay, you are not safe. Now it's bad. And then he's just like talking to Karen later, and he doesn't care. And it's like, that to me, like Eddie Quist is like probably the scariest movie character of 1981, bar none. Like he scares the crap out of me. And Picardo himself is like the nicest guy ever. And of course, he worked with, Dante on a ton of different movies. Cause I know he was in, he was in Inner Space, The Burbs, Gremlins 2. I don't think he was in the original Gremlins. He was in everything pretty much, like in some way, shape or form. He was in Small Soldiers.
Oh, right. Playing
a Quist then too. Which I'll
both
admit,
him and Dick Miller were in Small Soldiers, so we have some Small Soldiers connections.
we do, which is funny because I never picked up on his character name in Small Soldiers until probably about like 6 or 7 years ago, and I was just looking up something, and I was like, wait a minute, you mean like Eddie Quist, Ralph Quist? Okay, interesting. I see what you've done there, Joe Dante.
Shared cinematic universe.
Maybe. I think it's safe to say that yes, Small Soldiers and The Howling are a shared cinematic universe.
It's official.
Yes. So although I think we could just call it the Joe Dante universe, really.
I like that.
Yeah.
Doing Marvel before Marvel. Exactly.
So we haven't really talked a whole lot about Wolfen, which is probably the most serious out of all of the movies. But it's interesting because I'd only seen part of this as a kid. And then I kind of came to this one within the last few years. And I never realized that it was very much sort of like a police procedural, more so than anything, kind of mixed with sort of these indigenous folklore, which I think is really interesting. And I think it had a lot to say about how we treated Native Americans in the past and how we were continuing to treat them, going into this new decade, because this was, filmed in 1980. So, we're supposed to be on the cusp of all greatness. We have this quote unquote new president back then. And yet we were still treating certain groups within our society as these lesser people. But I remember seeing part of it as a kid, but I think then there was like a lot of male nudity, and then I was told to leave the room. So I never got to finish it because I think at a certain point you see little Edward James almost trompsing around on the beach. And I was like, I think at that point our parents were like, maybe this isn't the one for the kids. So I didn't come back until I was older. But I actually really like Wolfen, even though it is a lot more serious and it's a little drier. But I think Albert Finney in it is absolutely fantastic. It has like the greatest hair too, ever. I think of any Albert Finney character.
I think this was actually my first time watching Wolfen. I hadn't gotten to it until now. I was really into the mythology behind the creatures and the way the film blended folklore with, a modern setting and a different kind of werewolf and created, used it to make this creature. But the dryness of the film was really a difficult thing for me to get past. There was a lot of time where I don't know, I was expecting it to move a little bit faster than it did. And even though I was enjoying like any specific one scene because everyone in this film is really, really strong and they're able to carry the characters and the story well, but connecting the scenes to the scenes, I would always be like, okay, how did we get here again? What did I forget? So it was one of those movies dots. Where, I enjoyed it, but I enjoyed it more for the idea rather than the execution. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally does. I think there's 20 minutes of this movie you could totally lose.
Yeah.
And to keep things going. I mean, because it is almost 2 hours, and there's no reason this movie needs to be 2 hours. I mean, it's fun to sort of just watch if you're like, if you want to see like CSI Werewolves, or Law and Order Werewolf Units.
And then Mark Peterson shows up.
So it is a little bit, again, it is sort of the more straight laced, counterpart to all the different werewolf movies that were happening at the time. But I will say, like, there was something you mentioned, the performances, and there really isn't a bad one in the group. And I absolutely like, I remembered nothing about Tom Noonan in this movie. And I was just waiting for something to come, like some sort of realization, because Tom Noonan is always like the guy, right?
Yeah.
Like, he's always the guy that you're always suspecting is up to something, right? And then he's not. And you're like, oh, okay. Because then all of a sudden he's riding his motorcycle and boom, Wolfen gets him.
Right. And you're like, I'm so confused. That's not what I anticipated.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, this movie is like just brimming with character actors. Because as I mentioned, we have Albert Finney in it, and there's Edward James Olmos is in it as well. Gregory Hines is in it too. And I really, really enjoy his performance. You've got Tom Noonan. We joke about James Tolkien all the time, who is also the principal from Back to the Future. And we joke, like, because he plays a character that's called Baldy. And it was like, he really has never had hair. This poor guy. He's literally never had hair. And you even get like Reginald Vell Johnson shows up as one of the guys working in the morgue. So for me, it was like fun, just kind of seeing all the things that I never got to see from it and see where it went. I mean, but hey, Albert Finney gets some in the movie. So, they were selling Albert Finney as a sex symbol in this movie.
Yeah, it is amazing. And this was my first time seeing it as well. I know, I think Warner Archive put it out on Blu-ray within the last couple of years. I didn't even really, okay. So I think it just got lost in the shuffle, and then it just never seemed to be talked about when in the werewolf movie discussion, especially like, with the Howling and An American Werewolf in London coming out that year. You'd think that it would be brought up more. So it just kind of slipped through the cracks. But yeah, kind of definitely what Emily said, I really enjoyed certain aspects of it. Definitely a very different approach to the whole like werewolf mythology, way more of kind of like you mentioned, like a CSI or kind of police procedural. So very almost like thriller-esque in a way, or like mystery rather than like the full-on horror of the other two movies. But very interesting though. And I like how they use the camera effects to kind of put you in the point of view of the wolf. And it reminded me of like Predator a few years later, how you always felt like you were seeing things through the eyes of the killer. So I thought that was really cool. And I think that was something that you didn't really see as much back then too. But yeah, definitely a little more, I guess, just a different kind of taste. And so definitely not up there for me for as much as the other two, but I really appreciate like what they did with it. And also too, based on a book written by Whitley Strieber, who wrote Communion. So I was kind of like, whoa, he was, dabbling in a couple different genres there.
Yeah. I can't remember who it was that I talked to who worked on Communion. But like Whitley Strieber really believed in aliens. Like he really believed it. Like to him, like Communion was like the truth, which is almost interesting to me.
Like a retelling of what actually happened. Yeah.
So he said he would be a very fascinating guy to sort of talk to. I think he is still alive. I just looked really quickly because I was like, well, no, you can't talk to him if he's no longer here, unless you have a Ouija board. But yeah, like it's interesting that he, worked on, the book version is called The Wolfen, and then he did The Hunger, which the book for The Hunger came out in 1981, and then Communion just a few years later.
Wow. That's amazing that like all three of those two were adapted into films like relatively close to when the books came out. So that's a pretty good streak.
Yeah, he was
it's the Stryber trilogy.
Yeah, he's an interesting fella from all accounts. But yeah, I think there's something very fascinating, especially because, like, you know, when we talk about like New York now, and especially the Bronx, because of all of the gentrification that's happened, you know, throughout the boroughs and stuff over the last like 15, 20 years. The idea that the Bronx was like in this state of like urban decay to me is so strange, because now I bet people can't even afford to live in these areas these days. And then just to see it like in how it really was back then. And like 40 years later, it's like, well, if you want a 1-bedroom, you know, apartment there, it's like $2 million. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's so interesting, like that there's so many, you know, and again, if people who say like, oh, horror was never political or whatever, like everything is to a degree. But I think there was something, you know, that Michael Wadley here was really trying to say about like how it is, like how we take over communities or we take over land, and the effects of like of what our urbanization does to these areas and how it treats the people who come from these areas. And, you know, and then you have basically the Wolfen living amongst all of this, you know, decay and rubble and things like that. You know, I think because I'm an old lady, I find that really fascinating now. I don't know if it's because I've been doing school and doing a lot of like history stuff lately, like in the last year, where I'm like, ooh, I was like, this is just like what happened with the Irish when they immigrated here and went to Boston and things like that. And they started up their own little things. There's something really striking to me about like those parallels of like how, you know, over time, our country is constantly screwed over different communities because they could, and almost in every single instance, it was because of land. So
yeah,
and I think that soapbox.
No, I think, you know, that's raising some really interesting points about the movie itself and what was included in the text and the subtext. But, you know, like you were saying, when you compare it to what's happened since the movie came out, like it's another way of examining it, and how this stuff it's not isolated to one chapter in history. It's something that we keep doing and that we keep repeating.
Yeah. I think go ahead. Sorry, I'm Derek.
No, totally in agreement with what you're saying there, because you look at movies like that are set in like New York City in the early 80s, late 70s, and now like New York now, it's such a night and day difference. And then it's like, well, you know, all those generations and those families and everything, like they had to go somewhere, and, you know, we can't just like rebuild over everything and just pretend it didn't happen. So it's really interesting how, it almost had like a totally different style, and like, you know, and obviously a different culture too. And now it's like something else completely different and very expensive.
Yeah. Well, I think also too, I think the sort of no nonsense approach and sort of the more like gritty realism that comes through in Wolfen, comes from Wadley, because you talked about like before the show about my penchant for documentaries, but he is actually the filmmaker behind the Woodstock documentary that came out in 1970. And he only really ever worked mostly within documentary style projects. In fact, I think this is like his only film that he directed outside of that world, because he worked on like the Janis Joplin documentary and things like that. But he did like the really big documentary that came out where one of the editors on it was Thelma Schoonmaker, who's, you know, gone on to be an Academy Award winning editor. Also Martin Scorsese also edited on that documentary as well. I got to see most of it back when I actually had Turner Classic Movies. I never got to finish it, but I just realized I think it's on HBO Max. So I'm really excited about that. I just discovered it on some streaming service. All I knew was I was like, yes, I finally get to finish it, because I got through like I want to say it's like 4 hours or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I'm a hippie, and like from a different time. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm very drawn to the hippie cultures, I guess, or something like that. So, but I've always been really fascinated about Woodstock, and his documentary I thought was really interesting. Although it does portray the guy who ran Woodstock as a little better than he probably was. But I think that's probably why there feels like there's such life and such energy to movies like The Howling and American Werewolf, versus something like Wolfen, where I think Michael Wadley was just like making a very no nonsense movie about lupine mythology, and it was just like he was almost presenting it as fact, in a way. So I think that's why it differs so greatly from the others. But I guess I think it's the old lady in me where I'm just like, yeah, I like that Wolfen movie. Give me my boring werewolf movie any day.
Put it on a Sunday afternoon and let's enjoy some tea.
Yes. I know.
There is something soothing about that though, too, like the pace of those types of movies.
Yeah. I know. I feel bad that I didn't get a chance to jump into Full Moon High before we did this, because I watched that when the Blu-ray came out from Scream Factory, but that was I want to say 6 or 7 years ago now. I want to say is when that Blu-ray came out.
Time is fleeting.
It is. And I remember thinking it was cute and it was fun and it had a really fun cast. Because I remember I got really excited when Jim J. Bullock showed up in it, because I used to love Too Close for Comfort, which was like a goofy sitcom that was on in the 80s.
Oh, okay.
And it also had Ted Knight on it as well.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I used to watch that show a lot. So as soon as I was like, oh my God, Jim J. Bullock's in this. So I got really excited. He was also Prince Valium in Spaceballs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, but yeah, Full Moon High has a really, really great cast, because it has Pinky Tuscadero's in it. I'm totally blanking on the actress name, but she was the Fonz's girlfriend in Happy Days. Adam Arkin, who of course was in Halloween H20, right? Yes, he was Jamie Lee Curtis's boyfriend, and oh
my gosh,
Alan Arkin's also in it too, which I thought was kind of fun. But also Ed McMahon is in it too, which I never knew he was ever in movies until I watched this. But he was always a TV guy for me when I was growing up. So
this yeah, it's still a blind spot for me, and I definitely want to check it out.
Mm-hmm. It's Larry Cohen doing a werewolf movie. So
really, that's all you need to
know.
So I think if you can accept that, it's it almost feels like it's a movie that should have existed about 15 years earlier than it does, because it feels very much in line with something I was a teenage werewolf almost. Mm-hmm. So, but it's Larry Cohen through and through. So I think it's worth watching, and I'm really bummed I just didn't get a chance to make time for it. I haven't been doing anything else for the last few weeks, so.
Right, I know you've been totally lazy this entire time.
Absolutely, naps abound.
It's funny too, because what are the odds that Teen Wolf, which would come out a few years later, also in a high school, and then you have Full Moon High, these werewolf high school movies coming out in the same decade.
Yeah, for as much as werewolves make a really good vessel for this idea of the other, I think puberty is another good way to sort of, werewolves are really good to sort of be the mask for puberty.
Oh yeah. Ginger snaps forever.
Yep, they knew. So looking at obviously we're not ranking Wolfen at the height of everything. But so if you guys are popping in a werewolf movie, are you going American Werewolf? Are you going The Howling? Are you going both? Where does the rewatchability land for you guys?
I can rewatch American Werewolf any day, anytime. It doesn't matter if I just did it last night, I'll do it again. That movie has become a warm, fuzzy blanket for me. I still get really into it. The scary moments are still really intense, but it's a movie that has just gelled with me, and that gel has only gotten stronger over the years. So if I'm just going to pop in a werewolf movie for funners, it's going to be that one. If I decide I specifically want to rewatch The Howling, then I'll do that.
Interesting. How about for you?
Ooh, I think I would have to go with the same American Werewolf in London, just because it moves along so quickly. It's like everything about it just gels so nicely, and the comedy really, I think, gives it that high rewatchability factor. And Frank Oz in there, and just like the whole the doctor, like the we were watching and just busting out laughing with the bedpans and trying to like put them back into place in just the right order. It's just like there's so many great little moments of comedy in there that sometimes have nothing really to do with the narrative, but they're just like, you need that comic relief, and it just always comes at the right time. And so I think that one I think is just kind of like comfort food in a lot of ways. And although still very freaky, like the whole, dream sequences, especially with the Muppets and everything, like it feels like an actual nightmare. So, but yeah. But I do think, like you mentioned, a double feature, I think if you have people watch this one, then you're like, hey, you want to see another werewolf movie from 81? And then you put in The Howling, because I think that one still needs some help getting the word out for people who may not be aware of that whole era of werewolf movies.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for me, like, if I would have answered this question like 15 years ago, I probably would have gone American Werewolf. But you know what I think that really sells me is the score from Pino Donaggio. There's just something so comforting about that score, and something so familiar. Like I like the Elmer Bernstein score in there, but I think for me, the music that always stands out in American Werewolf are, the use of like Blue Moon and things like that, because they're so, they're so like these big punches of music that that's immediately what you think of. So I kind of lose American Werewolf score amongst everything else going on in that movie, when I hear the Howling music, I'm there. I'm immediately there. I'm up in the mountains, at the cookout. We're poor. Oh goodness. Oh, what's the old? I'm blanking on the old werewolf guy's name. He just wants to end it all.
I want to say
Sam. No.
Is it George? I'm just picking old man names, I think.
I think it was Slim Pickett. No, Slim Pickett.
Oh,
he was the sheriff guy.
Oh, okay.
I always get them mixed up in my head. And I believe that was John Carradine, who plays Erie. Okay. That's what it is. I always get John Carradine and Slim Pickens reversed in my head, because there's a picture of John Carradine. His headshot's actually in the movie theater in Gremlins. And I remember saying, Slim Pickens. And I was like, oh, wait, no, that is totally wrong. I'm an idiot. But him just lamenting over, I just want to end it. And I just, I want to be done. And I'm like, I get it, man. I just get it. It's like
almost like they're like the true knot from Dr. Sleep in a way.
They really are, like, especially like TC. He's like such a weird character. Like, I love that there's just like these characters. I mean, they both have great characters, though. But it's just like, I love sort of that weird, like, I've gone to a place on vacation and everybody's like looking at me, and they're both great examples of it. So it's interesting. Basically, never travel unless you either want to become a werewolf or deal with a werewolf.
Yeah, that is the moral of both of these stories.
Absolutely. And then apparently, if you want a dry police procedural werewolf movie, then you watch Wolfen.
Yeah.
But I feel like I'm underselling it because I really like it. I like the mythology. I just think there's something really interesting about that. And that scene when Albert Finney goes into the bar, and basically they're like laying out this whole story for him. Like I don't think I took a breath during that moment, because it just really caught me so unexpectedly. So
I love moments in movies where there's like a story, they're just telling a story and they're not really like showing it. It's like just a storytelling time. It's like the Quint effect from Jaws, where you're just, oh, it's a story within a story. And then you're kind of like, it just puts you in that moment a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also, the the American Werewolf, it kind of put like when you walk into a bar and you're not a regular there, and everyone just, like you said, just kind of stops and looks at you. It's just like, oh, okay, we're gonna sit over here now.
Yeah, but it's like, do you prefer like weird sort of like carnal werewolves, or do you prefer the "a naked man stole my balloons" werewolves?
Like, oh my God, that is my favorite line in that entire movie.
It's so good.
That kid is amazing, and I love it.
I wonder if like that kid, like, because like, of course now he's like 40 something years old, but I wonder if like that's like how he opens conversations, where he's like, you know who I am? Naked man stole my balloons when I was a kid at the zoo. And you're like, oh, you're that kid. That would be my calling card. If I was on social media, that would just be my bio.
Oh yeah. Worship me.
All right. Well, I think, is that about it for werewolves? I feel like we were very brief, but I mean, it's like, what do you even talk about American Werewolf or Howling at this point anymore that hasn't been like covered, because you have the amazing documentary Beware of the Moon from Paul Davis, and Scream Factory has done a fantastic job with celebrating the Howling over the years with several of their releases. I'm like, I don't even know what there's to say anymore.
I think this is not something new to say, but it's something that I haven't said yet in the past hour while we've been recording. So I'm going to add it just because my very, very favorite werewolf transformation scene is American Werewolf. It kind of set the bar for me. And a lot of what I enjoy about it, Rick Baker's effects are beyond anything. And all of the work that he and his team did on that is just amazing. But the thing I love the most about it is I've seen that movie 50 times. It's still scary because it looks like turning into a werewolf freaking hurts. So like I always get wrapped up in the scene because it looks so painful and so visceral. And my jaw is always on the floor because I'm just making this face that's just like, ah. And I think that, no matter how you do a werewolf transition, for me, that's how you make it look not real, but just believable. Like your character is going through something as they're making this transformation.
And it happens so suddenly too, which is another thing about it, is you keep thinking there's gonna be like a really big build up to it. And then it just like, he's just sitting there reading a book. And then all of a sudden, he's howling in pain and the transformation's happening. And there's like no warning really, other than Jack telling him it's going to happen. But then you're like, is it going to happen? Watching it the first time. And then some great music choices there as well with CCR in that scene. But yeah, that just really, I think, changed the game. And one of the reasons it's still the standard today is just how Baker just put it all out there. He wasn't afraid to like hide anything with the effects. He was like, the way they shine the lights on it, it just all works out so well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And those hands.
Oh, geez. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because I remember one of the problems, like, because like, Steve Johnson's like a wild card guy. And because he worked on the crew for American Werewolf. And so when he was doing the transformation for Fright Night for Evil Ed, one of his things that he always said, like, that kind of stuck in his craw a little bit about American Werewolf, was how symmetrical the transformation was in that sequence, where like everything sort of happened at the same time, like both hands went and both feet went, and he kind of felt like it would just sort of be random, right? Like maybe it wouldn't happen at the same time. So that's why with Evil Ed, it's a little different of a de-evolution once he becomes the werewolf or the wolf or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, it's like you still watch that scene and it's like you feel every bone crunch, just everything. But yeah, as a kid, like it completely fooled me. I really was like, oh my God, he's really a werewolf. Like, whereas Picardo's like transformation as Eddie Quist like felt a little more heightened, especially because of the way that they shot it and things like that. And, Dante's approach to it in general. But like, yeah, there's never going to be another transformation that's ever going to come close to this ever that we got in American Werewolf.
Mm-hmm.
Like people are going to be talking about it in another 40 years on some podcast, and they're going to be like, remember that werewolf transformation 80 years ago?
Still the best.
Still the best. I swear to God,
it'll be like their Wolfman from the 30s.
40 years, yeah. If we're still doing a podcast in 40 years, guys, kill me. Just put me out of my misery. I don't want to be.
Hey, now you sound like John Carradine.
I don't want to be some 83-year-old podcaster. I just don't.
You're like, what are podcasts on these days? What are the kids listening to?
They're probably just beamed straight into your brain or something like that.
Yeah, like Johnny Mnemonic style, it'll just be transported.
Yeah.
Holographic werewolf transformations.
Hell yeah. In your own weird living room.
Oh, geez. Oh, geez. Well, anyway, I think that'll wrap us up on our werewolves. So hopefully if you haven't seen Wolfen, don't let us deter you. I still think there's a lot of really good stuff there.
Oh yeah, totally. I think it's definitely.
But it's a much different beast, if you will, than the other movies we talked about. But I think it's fun. Yeah, I actually bought the Warner Archives version of Wolfen a few years ago from one of their sales, and I do not regret it. So it was a fun revisit. And it might make its way to the rotation, maybe not as much as the other movies, but I think it still has some good stuff to it. But yeah, I think that takes us to it, and I think we all have homework to do, and we have to I'll go watch Full Moon High.
Yes,
that's right.
I think we failed Mr. Cohen tonight, and I feel a little bad about that. But I do know that it's on a bunch of different streaming services. I know it's on like Amazon Prime right now. If you have Sling, it's on there. So, that's like kind of the ways you can watch it for free. Vudu, you can rent it for like $3 or something like that. But it's goofy and it's fun. It has a good heart to it. So
nice. Yeah, we've got homework.
Yes. As if we don't all have enough to do. So I think that kind of takes us to the end of our werewolf discussion. So first and foremost, everybody listening, thank you so much for supporting Corpse Club. If you want to find out more about us, you can go over to corpseclub.com, and for all your daily news, reviews, interviews, and all of our class of 1981 features, please check out dailydead.com or follow us over at Daily Dead News on Twitter to keep up with all of our content over there as well. A huge thank you to our editor, Brian, for making us sound great. And I think until next time, everybody, stay scary.